When Ibrahim Traoré's visa application was rejected, nobody knew this wasn't just a diplomatic decision. But when those leaked classified documents were opened, France's 70-year Africa policy collapsed. The phone rang at exactly 3:47 a.m. in the French Foreign Ministry. Ambassador Jean-Claude Moreau, France's head of African affairs, had been expecting this call for weeks. On the other end was Colonel Dubois, speaking from the classified operations center beneath the Élysée Palace. "The Burkina Faso situation has escalated beyond our projection," Dubois said, his voice tense. "Traoré's visa application landed on our desk this morning, and the intelligence we've gathered about his planned visit to Paris is concerning." Moreau rubbed his tired eyes, glancing at the stack of classified files spread across his desk. The Ibrahim Traoré dossier had grown thicker each month since the young captain had taken power in Burkina Faso. What had started as routine monitoring of another African coup leader had evolved into France's most sensitive intelligence operation in decades. "What exactly does he want to do in Paris?" Moreau asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "According to our sources inside his administration, he's requesting a meeting with President Macron to discuss what he calls historical accountability and reparation. But that's just the surface level. Our intelligence indicates he's carrying documents that could expose Operation Francafrique in its entirety." The word Francafrique sent a chill through Moreau's spine. For over 70 years, this shadow network had maintained France's economic dominance over its former African colonies through a complex web of military interventions, currency manipulation, and puppet government. It was the foundation of France's post-colonial power, worth hundreds of billions of euros annually to the French economy. "How much does he know?" Moreau asked. "Everything," Dubois replied grimly. "Our asset in Ouagadougou reports that Traoré has been meeting with former colonial administrators, accessing French archives that were supposed to be sealed indefinitely. He's compiled evidence of uranium theft, gold extraction quotas, and the CFA franc manipulation system. Most dangerously, he has documentation of the assassination programs." Moreau's blood ran cold. The assassination programs were the most closely guarded secret of French-African relations. Since 1960, France had orchestrated the elimination of over 40 African leaders who had threatened French economic interests. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, each death had been carefully orchestrated to look like internal African conflicts while protecting French mineral extraction rights worth trillions. "Sir," Dubois continued, "there's something else. Traoré isn't planning to meet with President Macron alone. He's arranged a press conference at the UNESCO headquarters. He intends to present his evidence to international media, with simultaneous broadcasts across Africa. Our analysis suggests this could trigger independence movements across 14 former French colonies." The implications were staggering. France's economy depended heavily on preferential access to African resources. Burkina Faso alone supplied 60% of France's uranium needs at prices far below market rate. Mali provided gold that funded French nuclear programs. Ivory Coast's cocoa and coffee filled French supermarkets at artificially low cost. If these arrangements were exposed and terminated, France would face the worst economic crisis since World War II. "What's our timeline?" Moreau asked. "Traoré's visa application requests entry for next Tuesday. The UNESCO press conference is scheduled for Thursday afternoon. We have less than 6 days to prevent what our economists are calling the end of French African hegemony." Moreau stood and walked to the window overlooking the Quai d'Orsay. Dawn was breaking over Paris, illuminating the city that had been built, in part, on African wealth extracted through 7 decades of neocolonial exploitation. The elegant buildings, the infrastructure, the social programs that made France a modern European power, all of it depended on maintaining control over African resources. "Reject the visa," Moreau said finally. "Classify it as a security concern. Cite terrorism threats if necessary. Sir, that will only delay the inevitable. Traoré can hold his press conference from Ouagadougou. The documents will still be released. Then we buy time to implement alternative measures." Moreau replied, his voice hardening. "Activate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was the code name for France's most extreme option, the complete destabilization of a threatening African government through coordinated economic warfare, media manipulation, and, if necessary, military intervention. It had been used successfully against Libya in 2011 and Ivory Coast in 2010, but implementing it against Burkina Faso would be more challenging. Unlike previous targets, Traoré had built alliances with Russia and China, creating alternative economic partnerships that reduced French leverage. 3 days later, the visa rejection letter was delivered to the Burkina Faso embassy in Paris. The official reason cited: scheduling conflicts and security concerns following recent terrorist activities in the Sahel region. It was bureaucratic language designed to obscure the real motivation, preventing the exposure of France's systematic exploitation of Africa. But the rejection had an unintended consequence. Instead of deterring Traoré, it confirmed his suspicions about French desperation. Within hours of receiving the rejection, he announced a televised address to the African Union, promising to reveal the true nature of France's relationship with Africa. In the basement of the French Foreign Ministry, a crisis team assembled around a conference table covered with satellite images, economic projections, and intelligence reports. Moreau addressed the room with grim urgency. "Gentlemen, we are facing the potential collapse of our African economic empire. Traoré's evidence is comprehensive and credible. If released, it will trigger a continental uprising against French influence. Our mining contracts, our military bases, our currency arrangements, everything is at risk." Economic Minister Dubois pulled up a holographic display showing France's African revenue streams. "Our preliminary calculations indicate that complete withdrawal from Africa would reduce French GDP by 14% within 2 years. Unemployment would rise to 18%. We would lose our status as a G7 economy." Defense Minister Laurent raised his hand. "What about military options? We have 5,000 troops stationed across the Sahel. Operation Barkhane infrastructure is already in place. Military intervention against Burkina Faso would be catastrophic," Moreau replied. "Unlike our previous operations, this would be seen as an obvious attempt to suppress evidence of our crimes. International opinion would turn decisively against us. The European Union would be forced to impose sanctions." Intelligence Director Rousseau leaned forward. "Sir, there's another complication. Our sources indicate that Traoré has shared copies of his evidence with leaders in Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal. Even if we neutralize him, the information is already distributed across multiple governments." The room fell silent as the full scope of the crisis became clear. This wasn't just about one rebellious African leader. It was about the potential end of France's post-colonial empire, the economic foundation that had sustained French prosperity for decades. "What exactly does Traoré have?" asked Minister Dubois. Rousseau opened a classified file. "Banking records showing the systematic undervaluation of African currency through the CFA franc system. Documentation of uranium mining agreements that pay Burkina Faso less than 5% of market rate. Correspondence between French officials discussing the elimination of uncooperative African leaders. Most damaging of all, he has the complete financial records of how African wealth has been channeled into French government accounts." "How did he obtain classified French government documents?" Moreau demanded. "We believe he was assisted by former French colonial administrators who developed conscience issues in retirement. Several have been providing him with archival materials for months. Our counterintelligence failed to detect the operation until it was too late." The betrayal from within added another layer to the crisis. French officials who had spent their careers managing African exploitation were now helping to expose it. This suggested that even within the French establishment, support for maintaining the colonial system was weakening. Moreau made a decision that would define France's future relationship with Africa. "We cannot prevent the release of this information through traditional means. Our only option is to get ahead of the story. We need to begin transitioning to a new model of French-African relations before Traoré forces us into a crisis." "You're suggesting we voluntarily end Francafrique?" asked Dubois, incredulous. "I'm suggesting we manage its transformation before African leaders unite to destroy it completely. If we act now, we can negotiate favorable terms for French businesses and maintain some influence. If we wait for Traoré's press conference, we'll lose everything." But even as Moreau spoke these words, he knew the French political establishment would never voluntarily surrender the wealth that African exploitation provided. The system had become too integrated into French economic planning, too essential to maintaining France's international status. 2 days after the visa rejection, French intelligence intercepted communications between Traoré and several international news organizations. He was arranging exclusive interviews with BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and France 24 itself. The irony was unmistakable. France's own state media would be forced to broadcast the evidence of French crimes in Africa. The intercepted messages revealed the sophistication of Traoré's media strategy. He wasn't just planning to dump documents and hope for attention. He had coordinated with investigative journalists, economists, and legal experts to provide comprehensive analysis of French exploitation. The presentation would include detailed financial calculations showing how much wealth had been extracted from each African country, projections of what African economies could achieve with fair resource pricing, and legal frameworks for pursuing reparations through international courts. In Ouagadougou, Traoré was preparing for what he knew would be the most important speech of his life. He understood that exposing French exploitation would trigger massive retaliation. Economic sanctions, military threats, and assassination attempts were all likely responses. But he also knew that remaining silent would condemn future generations of Africans to continued poverty, while their resources enriched European powers. The classified documents spread across his desk told a story of systematic theft spanning 7 decades. France had extracted over $500 billion in wealth from Africa since 1960, paying below-market rates for uranium, gold, oil, and agricultural products, while forcing African countries to store their foreign currency reserves in French banks where they earned minimal interest. The most damning evidence concerned the assassination program. French intelligence documents detailed the elimination of 37 African leaders who had threatened French economic interests. Each operation had been carefully planned to appear as internal African conflict, with French fingerprints carefully erased from the historical record. Traoré's advisors had warned him about the personal risks of releasing this information. Thomas Sankara, his predecessor and inspiration, had been assassinated just days before planning to expose similar evidence. But Traoré believed that international attention and modern communication technology would make assassination more difficult to accomplish without obvious French culpability. On the morning of his planned departure to Paris, Traoré received the visa rejection letter. As he read the bureaucratic language designed to obscure French panic, he smiled grimly. The rejection was itself evidence of French desperation. If his planned revelations were false or insignificant, France would have allowed the meeting to proceed, confident in their ability to dismiss his claims. "Cancel the Paris trip," Traoré told his chief of staff. "We're doing this from Ouagadougou. Schedule the UNESCO press conference for next week, but broadcast it simultaneously from the presidential palace. I want every African to see this." In Paris, French officials monitored African communications with growing alarm. Traoré's decision to hold his press conference from Burkina Faso actually made the situation worse for France. Instead of a single presentation to international media, he was planning a continent-wide broadcast that would reach hundreds of millions of Africans directly. Intelligence reports indicated that other African leaders were preparing supportive statements. Mali's transition government announced they would provide full transparency regarding their relationship with France. Niger's president scheduled his own press conference for the day after Traoré's presentation. A coordinated African uprising against French influence was materializing. French President Macron convened an emergency cabinet meeting to address the crisis. The discussion was heated, with various ministers proposing increasingly desperate measures to prevent the exposure of French exploitation. "We could offer Burkina Faso substantial development aid in exchange for silence," suggested the development minister. "With what credibility?" replied Foreign Minister Moreau. "They have documentation showing how our aid programs are designed to maintain dependency while extracting resources." Defense Minister Laurent raised the possibility of cyber warfare. "We could disable their broadcasting capabilities, make it appear as technical difficulty. That would only delay the inevitable and confirm their accusations about French interference," Moreau responded. As the cabinet debated, President Macron remained silent, reviewing the intelligence summary of Traoré's evidence. The documentation was comprehensive and irrefutable. Decades of French policies designed to maintain African poverty while extracting wealth were laid out in meticulous detail. "Gentlemen, Macron finally spoke. "We are not debating whether to prevent this information from being released. That's no longer possible. We are deciding how France will respond when it becomes public knowledge." The admission that France could not suppress the evidence marked a turning point in the crisis. For the first time since decolonization, France was losing control of the narrative about its relationship with Africa. Macron continued, "Our choice is between acknowledging past exploitation and beginning genuine reform, or denying everything and facing a complete breakdown in African relations. The first option preserves some French influence. The second option guarantees we lose everything." The room erupted in heated arguments. Hardline ministers argued that admitting to exploitation would invite reparations claims worth trillions of euros. Moderate voices suggested that maintaining the current system was becoming impossible anyway, as African leaders were increasingly resistant to French manipulation. While French officials debated their response, Traoré was finalizing his presentation. The speech would last 90 minutes and be divided into 3 sections: historical documentation of French exploitation, economic analysis of the wealth extracted from Africa, and a legal framework for pursuing justice and reparation. The historical section included original French government documents authorizing the elimination of African leaders, banking records showing the systematic undervaluation of African resources, and correspondence between French officials discussing strategies for maintaining African dependency. The economic analysis provided detailed calculations of how much wealth France had extracted from each African country. Burkina Faso alone had lost an estimated $47 billion in uranium revenue due to below-market pricing arrangement. Mali's gold had been systematically undervalued by 60% compared to international rates. Ivory Coast's agricultural exports had been purchased at prices that provided French companies with profit margins exceeding 400%. The legal framework outlined how affected African countries could pursue reparations through the International Court of Justice, the African Court of Human and People's Rights, and national courts in countries that had implemented universal jurisdiction for economic crimes. 3 days before Traoré's scheduled press conference, French intelligence intercepted a communication that changed everything. African Union leaders were planning to attend the presentation in person, demonstrating continental solidarity with Burkina Faso's revelation. The president of Ghana, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and representatives from 23 African countries would be present for what was being called Africa's Declaration of Economic Independence. The French crisis team realized they were no longer dealing with one rebellious leader, but with a coordinated African movement to end French economic dominance. Military intervention was impossible against such a broad coalition. Economic retaliation would only confirm African accusations about French neocolonialism. On the evening before Traoré's press conference, Ambassador Moreau placed a final call to his counterpart in Ouagadougou. It was a last attempt to negotiate a face-saving compromise for France. "President Traoré," Moreau began carefully, "France is prepared to discuss substantial modifications to our economic arrangements with Burkina Faso. We could triple uranium payments, provide debt forgiveness, and establish a genuine development partnership." Traoré's response was calm but uncompromising. "Ambassador, your offer confirms everything I'm planning to reveal tomorrow. France only discusses fair arrangements when forced by the threat of exposure. How many other African leaders have you made similar offers to prevent them from speaking out?" The conversation lasted 20 minutes, with Moreau becoming increasingly desperate and Traoré remaining steadfast in his determination to proceed with the revelation. As the call ended, both men knew they had reached a historical turning point in French-African relations. The next morning, as Traoré prepared for his press conference, French officials were implementing crisis protocols designed to minimize the damage to French interests. Emergency meetings with African leaders were scheduled, development aid packages were hastily assembled, and media strategies were deployed to frame the revelations as anti-French propaganda. But the comprehensive nature of Traoré's evidence made denial impossible. Bank records, government documents, and recorded conversations provided irrefutable proof of systematic exploitation. France's only option was to acknowledge past mistakes and negotiate the terms of a new relationship with Africa. As Traoré walked to the podium, surrounded by African leaders and international media, He carried with him the documentation that would end France's 70-year economic empire in Africa. The visa rejection that was meant to prevent this moment had instead confirmed French desperation and strengthened African resolve to pursue economic independence. The first words of his speech would resonate across the continent. Today, we present evidence that will forever change how the world understands the relationship between France and Africa. The documents you are about to see reveal the true cost of French prosperity and the systematic impoverishment of our continent. As cameras rolled and the broadcast began, both Traoré and French officials knew that African liberation from European economic control was no longer a dream, but an inevitable reality that would reshape global power structures for generations to come. The visa rejection, intended as a simple bureaucratic obstruction, had instead become the catalyst for the most significant transformation in African-European relations since the end of formal colonialism. France's 70-year economic empire was ending, not through military conquest or diplomatic pressure, but through the power of documented truth and African unity.